Alright guys, so this is a continuation from the last few videos. We are graphing trig functions. If you're in trig, this is from 5.5, and then we'll probably start off 5.6. And if pre-cal, same thing, but for 4.5 and then 4.6. So the function that was given is 2 times cosine of 3x minus pi. The fact that this pi is inside parentheses lets me know that that's the c, and that I have no d. Okay, so there's no vertical shift. So my trig function is a cosine, and it is positive. So I already know that at the end, it's going to look like a U, like a little hammock. Okay. My amplitude is 2. My cycle is 2 pi divided by b, which in this case is 3. Okay. Horizontal shift is opposite the sign. So being that this is minus, it's going to go to the positive direction. And then it's going to be c divided by b. So pi over 3. Vertical shift, I didn't move up or down. There is no d. So that means my midline is going to stay at the x-axis. Okay. And next, my increment is 1/4 of my cycle, which is 2 pi over 3. Now, if you don't catch it right away, you can multiply straight across, and you have 2 pi over 12, and then you can reduce. Or you could even reduce right here that you see the 2 and the 4. Okay? Either way would work fine. But either of the two ways, you should end up at pi over 6 as your increment. Okay? So now for my 5 points, remember that the first of my 5 points is dependent on my horizontal shift. If I don't have a horizontal shift, then it's at 0. So point number 1 is pi over 3. Point number 2 is grabbing pi over 3 and adding my increment, which is pi over 6, exactly. Now, in order to add these, I am going to need a common denominator, which means I'm going to have to multiply the first one by 2 over 2. So now we have 2 pi over 6 plus pi over 6. This gives me 3 pi over 6. So here I had my first point. Here I have my second. I know you might have the urge to reduce that to pi over 2, but hold that urge. If you want to do that, do it at the very end, okay? That way we don't have to keep finding common denominator all the way through. So now I'm going to get my previous point, 3 pi over 6, and add my increment, pi over 6. We have 4 pi over 6. And hopefully you start seeing the pattern. If I'm continuously adding a single pi over 6, it went from 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, then I'm going to get 5 pi over 6, good. And then I'd get, right. I'm going to go through the motions for your notes. But feel free to use that thought process, okay? All right, so now comes time to draw the graph. Before I draw my x and y axis, I like to look at my 5 points. The fact that all of my 5 points land positive, I draw the y axis all the way to the left. If you look at the last video, we had some negative values in my 5 points, so I drew my y axis a little bit more centered, okay? So the first thing we're going to draw, again in order of the notes, according to the first video for this lesson, is our midline and our amplitude. So our midline is at the x-axis. It's going to stay right there. Our amplitude from 0 is going to go up 2. If I go up 2 from 0, I land at 2. And then I'm going to go down 2. landing at -2. Okay? On a quiz or test, this would be 1 point. The midline with the amplitude. The next thing I'm going to do is my 5 points. This would be your second point on a quiz or test. And here, whether you reduce or not, as long as you have the correct value, I will give you full credit, okay? And now, the third point goes to drawing the correct graph. So remember, we had given ourselves this little side note up here as to what the image was going to look like, okay? The biggest mistake that I see, and students will do all of this correct, and then when they go to draw here, they'll put their first point on the y-axis. Remember, the first point shifted to pi/3, so I should start my first point at pi/3. Cosine starts on the maximum, comes to the midline, down to the minimum, back to the midline, and then back up to the maximum. And there is your cosine graph. All right, let's take a look at this next question. Okay, it is another cosine graph. The big difference here is that this one's negative. So when I go to draw this, wherever it is, instead of looking like a valley, it's going to look like a mountain, okay? It's going to flip upside down. So now my amplitude is 3. If you write -3 or +3 on your paper, it's fine as long as you remember that amplitude goes in both directions. So whether you put the positive or negative doesn't matter. As long as when you draw it, you go up 3 and down 3. My cycle, again, is 2 pi divided by b. Here, my b is 4. This reduces to pi/2. Okay? Now, vertical and horizontal shift. Notice the way that the question is written. Because this +1 is outside of the parentheses, it is your D. It is part of your vertical and not horizontal shift. So I do not have a C. Okay? Even if I drop these parentheses, the fact that that 1 is not inside of a parentheses means that it is not your C. Okay? So for horizontal shift, it is C divided by B. Since I don't have a C, you could either directly go to the conclusion that there's none, or if you want to see the math behind it, it would be 0 divided by 4, which is 0. Okay, so because there is no horizontal shift, that means that my first point is going to be at 0, at the origin. Okay, now I do have a D over here, so my vertical shift is a +1, which means it's going to move up 1. And now +1 is my midline. My increments is 1/4 of my cycle. So that gives me pi/8. Okay? So if my first point of the 5 is at 0, I'm going to say 0 plus my increment. 0 plus pi/8 is pi/8. And if I continue to add a single pi/8, what do you think my next point is? 2 pi/8 and then 3 pi/8 and so on. So again, I'm going to show you the work just for your notes, but feel free to use that mentality. All right. And now we have our 5 points. So when I go to draw this, again, I take a peek at my 5 points. I see that they are all positive. So I can draw my y-axis all the way to the left. Okay. Again, according to those notes we talked about in the first video, the first thing that you draw is your midline. My midline is up 1, okay? So I'm going to draw a little tally here that says 1, and I'm going to draw my new midline. Okay? Now be careful with this part. My amplitude is 3. 3 is the amount that I move up and down. So if I move up 3 from 1, what number do I land at? Good. And if I move 3 down from a positive 1, where do I land at? Negative 2. So I go down to 0, then to negative 1, then to negative 2. Okay? Whenever we have a vertical shift, these numbers are where I see the most mistakes on. So be careful, okay? Next, I'm going to place my 5 points. Feel free to place your 5 points on the midline, okay?
But that doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, that doesn't matter. As long as when you draw it in the right place, that's fine. So the first is at 0. Then pi over 8. Then 2 pi over 8. 3 pi over 8. And 4 pi over 8. Okay? Now again, we're looking over here, we're drawing an upside down cosine because it was negative. So that means instead of starting at the maximum, my first point, which is 0, is going to start at my minimum. Being able to draw these 5 dots is the most important part here. So now cosine on my second point at pi over 8 goes to the midline. Third point goes up to the maximum. Fourth point comes back to the midline. And fifth point comes down to the minimum again. And there is your negative cosine graph.